Hey guys, Miss Byer here. Today we're going to look at how the Enlightenment ideas helped spur the American colonies to shed British rule and create a new nation. Let's set the stage. You can follow along with me on page 640. Philosophers such as Voltaire considered England's government the most progressive in Europe. The Glorious Revolution of 1688 had given England a constitutional monarchy. In essence, this meant that various laws limited the power of the English king. Despite the view of the philosophers, however, a growing number of England's colonists in North America accused England of tyrannical rule. Emboldened by Enlightenment ideas, they would attempt to overthrow what was then the mightiest power on earth and create their own nation. At this point, you may want to pause the video, type your notes, and then press play. Let's look at Britain and its American colonies. Throughout the 1600s and 1700s, British colonists had formed a large and thriving settlement along the eastern shore of North America. When George III became King of Great Britain in 1760, his North American colonies were growing by leaps and bounds. Their combined population soared from about 250,000 in 1700 to 2 million in 1770, a nearly nine-fold increase. Economically, the colonies thrived on trade with the nations of Europe. Along with increasing population and prosperity, a new sense of identity was growing in the colonists' minds. By the mid-1700s, colonists had been living in America for nearly 150 years. Each of the 13 colonies had its own government, and people were used to a great degree of independence. Colonists saw themselves less as British and more as Virginians or Pennsylvanians. However, they were still British subjects and were expected to obey British law. In 1651, the British Parliament passed a trade law called the Navigation Act. This and subsequent trade laws prevented colonists from selling their most valuable products to any country except Britain. In addition, colonists had to pay high taxes on imported French and Dutch goods. Nonetheless, Britain's policies benefited both the colonies and the motherland. Britain bought American raw materials for low prices and sold manufactured goods to the colonists. And despite various British trade restrictions, colonial merchants also thrived. Such a spirit of relative harmony, however, soon would change. At this point, I advise you to pause the video, type your notes, and then follow along with me at the top of page 641 on Americans Win Independence. In 1754, war erupted on the North American continent between the English and the French. As you recall, the French had also colonized parts of North America throughout the 1600s and 1700s. The conflict was known as the French and Indian War. The name stems from the fact that the French enlisted numerous Native American tribes to fight on their side. The fighting lasted until 1763, when Britain and her colonists emerged victorious and seized nearly all French land in North America. The victory, however, only led to growing tensions between Britain and its colonists. In order to fight the war, Great Britain had run up a huge debt. Because American colonists benefited from Britain's victory, Britain expected the colonists to help pay the cost of the war. In 1765, Parliament passed the Stamp Act. According to this law, colonists had to pay a tax to have an official stamp put on the wills, deeds, newspapers, and other printed material. American colonists were outraged. They had never paid taxes directly to the British government before. Colonial lawyers argued that the stamp tax violated colonists' natural rights, and they accused the government of taxation without representation. In Britain, citizens consented to taxes through their representatives in Parliament. The colonists, however, had no representation in Parliament. Thus, they argued they could not be taxed. Please pause the video, type your notes, and then follow along with me on page 641. Growing hostilities lead to war. Over the next decade, hostilities between the two sides increased. Some colonial leaders favored independence from Britain. In 1773, to protest an important tax on tea, a group of colonists dumped a large load of British tea into the Boston harbor. George III, infuriated by the Boston Tea Party, as it was called, ordered the British Navy to close the port of Boston. Such harsh tactics by the British made enemies of many moderate colonists. In September 1774, representatives from every colony except Georgia gathered in Philadelphia to form the First Continental Congress. This group protested the treatment of Boston. When the king paid little attention to their complaints, the colonies decided to form the Second Continental Congress to debate their next moves. On April 19, 1775, British soldiers and American militiamen exchanged gunfire on the village green in Lexington, Massachusetts. The fighting spread to nearby Concord. The Second Continental Congress voted to raise an army and organize for battle under the command of a Virginian named George Washington. The American Revolution had begun. Remember to pause the video, record your notes, and then resume play, following along with me at the bottom of page 641, The Influence of the Enlightenment. Colonial leaders used Enlightenment ideas to justify independence. The colonists had asked for the same political rights as people in Britain. They said, but the king had stubbornly refused. Therefore, the colonists were justified in rebelling against a tyrant who had broken the social contract. In July 1776, the Second Continental Congress issued the Declaration of Independence. This document, written by the political leader Thomas Jefferson, was firmly based on the ideas of John Locke and the Enlightenment. The Declaration reflected these ideas in its eloquent argument for natural rights. "We hold these truths to be self-evident," stated the beginning of the Declaration, "that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Since Locke had asserted that people had the right to rebel against an unjust ruler, the Declaration of Independence included a long list of George III's abuses. The document ended by declaring the colonies' separation from Britain. The colonies, the Declaration said, are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown. Pause the video here, type your notes, and then resume play, following along with me on page 642, Successes for the Colonists. The British were not about to let their colonies leave without a fight. Shortly after the publication of the Declaration of Independence, the two sides went to war. At first, the colonists seemed destined to go down in quick defeat. Washington's ragtag, poorly trained army faced well-trained forces of the most powerful country in the world. In the end, however, the Americans won their war for independence. Several reasons explain the colonists' success. First, the Americans' motivation for fighting was much stronger than that of the British, since their army was defending their homeland. Second, the overconfident British generals made several mistakes. Third, time itself was on the side of the Americans. The British could win battle after battle, as they did, and still lose the war. Fighting an overseas war 3,000 miles from London was terribly expensive. After a few years, tax-weary British citizens called for peace. Finally, the Americans did not fight alone. Louis XVI of France had little sympathy for the ideals of the American Revolution. However, he was eager to weaken France's rival, Britain. French entry into the war in 1778 was decisive. In 1781, combined forces of about 9,500 Americans and 7,800 French trapped a British army commanded by Lord Cornwallis near Yorktown, Virginia. Unable to escape, Cornwallis eventually surrendered. The Americans had shocked the world and won their independence. Go ahead and pause the video, type your notes, and then resume with me on page 644 with Americans Create a Republic. Shortly after declaring their independence, the 13 individual states recognized the need for a national government. As victory became certain, all 13 states ratified a constitution in 1781. This plan of government was known as the Articles of Confederation. The Articles established the United States as a republic, a government in which citizens rule through elected representatives. It was a weak national government, though. To protect their authority, the 13 states created a loose confederation in which they held most of the power. Thus, the Articles of Confederation deliberately created a weak national government. There were no executive or judicial branches. Instead, the Articles established only one body of government, the Congress. Each state, regardless of size, had one vote in Congress. Congress could declare war, enter into treaties, and coin money. It had no power, however, to collect taxes or regulate trade. Passing new laws was difficult because the laws needed the approval of 9 of the 13 states. These limits on the national government soon produced many problems. Although the new national government needed money to operate, it could only request contributions from the states. Angry Revolutionary War veterans bitterly complained that the Congress still owed them back pay for their services. Meanwhile, several states issued their own money. Some states put tariffs on goods from neighboring states. Pause the video, type your notes, and then resume with me at the bottom of page 644, A New Constitution. Colonial leaders eventually recognized the need for a strong national government. In February 1787, Congress approved a constitutional convention to revise the Articles of Confederation. The Constitutional Convention held its first session May 25, 1787. The 55 delegates were experienced statesmen who were familiar with the political theories of Locke, Montesquieu, and Rousseau. Although the delegates shared basic ideas on government, they sometimes disagreed on how to put them into practice. For almost 4 months, the delegates argued over important questions. Who should be represented in Congress? How many representatives should each state have? The delegates' deliberations produced not only compromise, but also new approaches to governing. Using the political ideas of the Enlightenment, the delegates created a new system of government. Let's look at the development of democracy in the United States. Ancient Greece and Rome were strong influences on the framers of the United States system of government. Democracy, as it is practiced today, however, is different from the Greek and Roman models. The most famous democracy today is in the United States. The type of government of the United States uses is called a federal republic. Federal means power is divided between the national and state governments. In a republic, the people vote for the representatives. 2 key components of democracy in the United States are the Constitution and voting. Many of the ideas contained in the Constitution are built on the ideas of the Enlightenment thinkers, as you can see in the chart on the screen. Many of the ideas of the American democracy system is a logical outgrowth of the Enlightenment ideas. The framers of the Constitution took the ideas of different thinkers in different times and combined them into a new and unique way of thinking about government, which the U.S. Constitution represents. From the chart, we can see that Locke's idea about a government's power coming from the consent of the people is represented in the U.S. Constitution. The very beginning of that Constitution, the preamble, begins with, "We the people of the United States to establish legitimacy." Establish legitimacy means consent of the people. The people give consent to the government to rule them in specific ways. This creates a representative government, a government whose legitimacy is represented by the people. And because it's based on Locke's idea that a government's power comes from the consent of the people, it will also limit the government's powers to only provide the needs the people are asking for. When we look at Montesquieu and his ideas on the separation of power, we see a federal system of government in which you have state power and government and national power. The national power is divided among three branches. You have your executive, your legislative, and your judicial. And all three of those branches provide a system of checks and balances so that no one branch can become more powerful than the other, creating again a monarchy or a tyrannical government. Instead, we have separation of powers provided from the idea of Montesquieu. We also see Rousseau's ideas of direct democracy, where the people participate in choosing those representatives. We have public elections of the president and of our congressmen. And Voltaire, his ideas about freedom of speech, religious toleration, these are represented in the first 10 amendments known as the Bill of Rights, which provide for freedom of speech and religion. And finally, Beccaria, he believed that the accused, people who committed crimes or were accused of committing crimes, still had rights and that they should not be tortured. This is reflected also in the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights protects the rights of the accused, and it prohibits cruel and unusual punishment. This is why you are not guilty until proven guilty in a court system, in a justice system. And no harm can come to you, whether accused and declared guilty or accused and declared not guilty. No cruel and unusual punishment will come to that person. Our justice system very much represents the accused and tries to decree that they are not guilty unless all evidence proves them guilty. This is also an Enlightenment idea. Getting back into your notes, pause the video here. Let's look at the federal system and the Bill of Rights. The federal system, or beginning with the federal system, like Montesquieu, the delegates trusted a powerful central government controlled by one person or group. They therefore established three separate branches: the legislative, the executive, and the judicial. This setup provided a built-in system of checks and balances, with each branch checking the actions of the other two. For example, the president received the power to veto legislation passed by Congress. However, the Congress could override a presidential veto with the approval of 2/3 of its members. Although the Constitution created a strong central government, it did not eliminate local governments. Instead, the Constitution set up a federal system in which power was divided between the national and the state governments. Furthermore, we have the Bill of Rights. You can follow along with me on page 645. The delegates signed the new Constitution on September 17, 1787. In order to become law, however, the Constitution required approval by conventions by conventions in at least 9 of the 13 states. These conventions were marked by sharp debate. Supporters of the Constitution were called Federalists. They argued in their famous work, the Federalist Papers, that the new government would provide a better balance between national and state powers. Their opponents, the Anti-Federalists, feared that the Constitution gave the central government too much power. The Anti-Federalists also wanted a Bill of Rights to protect the rights of individual freedoms. In order to gain support, the Federalists promised to add a Bill of Rights to the Constitution. This promise cleared the way for approval. Congress formally added to the Constitution the 10 amendments known as the Bill of Rights. These amendments protected such basic rights as freedom of speech, press, assembly, and religion. Many of these rights had been advocated by Voltaire, Rousseau, and Locke. The Constitution and the Bill of Rights marked a turning point in people's ideas about government. Both documents put Enlightenment ideas into practice. They expressed an optimistic view that reason and reform could prevail, and that progress was inevitable. Such optimism swept across the Atlantic. However, the monarchies and the privileged classes didn't give up power and position as easily. As we move into our next chapter, we will see the struggle to attain the principles of the Enlightenment lead to violent revolutions in France.